Nobody saw this coming, not like this. What started as a simple celebrity back and forth between Katt Williams and Steve Harvey has spiraled into something the internet can't stop dissecting. Old interviews, hidden details, resurfaced names, and alleged connections are all being pulled into one massive, confusing pattern. And at the center of it all, one question keeps growing louder. Is this just another Hollywood rumor cycle, or something much deeper unfolding in real time? Because the more people look, the less anything feels random, and that's exactly what makes this story impossible to ignore. Nobody saw this coming, not like this. It started as another back and forth in the world of comedy and celebrity commentary, the kind of tension the internet usually laughs off and moves past within a day. But this time, something shifted. The tone changed. The energy got heavier, and suddenly it stopped feeling like entertainment. It began with Katt Williams speaking about Steve Harvey, but what caught everyone off guard wasn't just the criticism. It was where the conversation seemed to go next. The focus slowly drifted away from Steve himself and toward Marjorie Harvey. And according to claims circulating online and interpretations of Katt's comments, she wasn't just being mentioned in passing anymore. She was being positioned at the center of something much bigger. Some viewers believe Katt was suggesting there's more happening behind the public image than people realize. That what fans see on stage, on TV, and in interviews might only be part of a much deeper structure operating behind the scenes. And once that idea was planted, the internet did what it always does. It started digging. Old interviews resurfaced. Viral clips were rewatched with a different lens. Even casual jokes from years ago were suddenly being analyzed like hidden messages. And the more people looked, the more questions started forming. Not because anything was proven, but because patterns, real or imagined, began to feel connected in the minds of viewers. At the center of it all was Katt Williams, a comedian known for never filtering his thoughts about Hollywood. Over the years, he's made repeated claims that the entertainment industry operates with invisible rules, systems that reward compliance and punish resistance. Most of the time, people dismissed his comments as frustration or exaggeration. But this time, audiences felt the reaction was different. Because when Steve Harvey entered the conversation, the response wasn't casual anymore. According to interpretations of Katt's interviews, he didn't just criticize Steve's public image. He questioned its authenticity. Steve Harvey has long been seen as the ultimate family man figure in entertainment. Motivational, composed, and polished. A man who built an empire on advice, positivity, and personal success stories. But Katt, according to viewers dissecting his words, wasn't convinced that everything matched the image. And that's where things escalated. As these comments spread online, Steve Harvey's responses in past interviews also started circulating again. Some pointed out moments where he appeared unusually emotional or defensive when Katt's name came up. In one instance, Steve even issued a public warning toward Katt, something many people didn't expect from someone whose brand is built on calm authority and positivity. That reaction alone fueled more speculation. Why such a strong response? Why let it become personal at all? And then another name kept appearing in the background discussions. Marjorie Harvey. At first, she wasn't part of the conversation directly. She wasn't giving interviews or making statements. But online discourse rarely needs direct involvement to build narratives. Some users began suggesting that her influence in Steve's life and career might be more significant than what's publicly visible. Others pushed back, calling it pure speculation fueled by internet storytelling. Still, the conversation continued growing. People began analyzing every interaction, every public appearance, every timeline shift in Steve Harvey's career and personal life. Not because there was clear evidence of anything hidden, but because the human mind naturally searches for patterns when stories become emotionally charged. And Katt's comments, whether taken literally or symbolically, acted like fuel. He has long spoken about unseen power dynamics in entertainment, claiming that success often comes with compromises the public never sees. Whether one agrees with him or not, his reputation for refusing to stay silent has made every statement of his feel like a spark in a dry field. But what made this situation different was how quickly the narrative expanded beyond him and Steve. It became about influence, about control, about who shapes public perception behind the curtain of celebrity life. And once those themes entered the conversation, the internet filled in the blanks on its own. Meanwhile, supporters of Steve Harvey pushed back strongly. They argued that his career speaks for itself, decades of success across comedy, television, writing, and hosting. To them, the idea that his public image is anything but earned felt like an unfair rewriting of history. Others, however, weren't focused on proving anything. They were focused on the pattern itself. The idea that certain figures in entertainment seem to rise in very specific, very strategic ways while controversies around them remain unanswered or unresolved. That's where the debate split. On one side, people saw Katt Williams as someone finally eyeing what others are afraid to say out loud. On the other, people saw a dangerous mix of speculation and storytelling being mistaken for truth. But regardless of where anyone stood, one fact was undeniable. The conversation had escaped control. What began as commentary between two public figures had evolved into a larger cultural argument about fame, power, image, and influence. And as more clips resurfaced and more opinions spread, the line between fact and interpretation became harder for many viewers to separate. Still, the most intense part of the discussion wasn't what was said directly. It was what people believed was being implied. Because once a narrative reaches that level, it stops being about evidence alone. It becomes about perception, about belief, about how audiences interpret silence, timing, and reaction. And in this case, every reaction, whether from Katt Williams or Steve Harvey, was being analyzed like a piece of a puzzle. But even now, nothing is officially confirmed. Nothing concrete has been proven behind the viral claims or interpretations circulating online. What exists instead is a growing storm of commentary, speculation, and resurfaced moments being viewed through a new lens. And that's what makes this situation so unstable. Because the deeper people go into it, the less it feels like a simple disagreement, and the more it feels like a story everyone is trying to solve, but no one fully understands. And according to the way this narrative is unfolding online, this might not be the end of it. It might just be the point where everything starts getting louder. And suddenly, all those old stories that people once ignored started to feel different. Not new, just reinterpreted. Details that were once brushed off as celebrity noise were now being replayed, analyzed, and connected in ways nobody expected. And once that shift happened, the entire tone of the conversation changed again. Because people didn't just start remembering things, they started rearranging them. Now add something else into the picture. Steve Harvey's past relationships, especially his highly publicized marriage to Mary Shackelford. At the time, it was treated like a typical Hollywood breakup, messy, emotional, but ultimately just another chapter in a celebrity's personal life. But looking back now, in the middle of all this renewed attention, people weren't seeing it the same way anymore. There were allegations back then, claims of betrayal, emotional conflict, legal disputes, public accusations that never really found a final resolution in the court of public opinion. Nothing was ever fully settled in the way people like closure. So it got labeled what it always gets labeled, a messy divorce. And everyone moved on. Until now. Because when Katt Williams' recent comments entered the conversation, people started revisiting that entire chapter with a completely different mindset. It wasn't just nostalgia or curiosity. It was suspicion mixed with reinterpretation. Old interviews were rewatched. Old headlines were re-examined. Even minor details that nobody thought mattered suddenly felt like they belonged to a larger puzzle. And that's where things started to shift from casual speculation into something more intense. Because if even a fraction of what's being implied now were true, then this wouldn't just be about jokes, fame, or public personas. It would be about something deeper, something structured, something that might have been unfolding quietly for years behind closed doors, while everyone else was focused on the spotlight. And the scariest part, that feeling of we're only seeing the surface, started spreading fast. Because in the next phase of this story, things didn't just escalate. They broke containment. Up until this point, people could still laugh it off. They could still say, it's just Katt being Katt, or it's just another celebrity feud. That was the safe interpretation. But then the tone shifted completely. Katt Williams stopped speaking in vague commentary. He stopped hinting. He stopped joking around the edges. And instead, he started speaking directly in a way that made people sit up and pay attention. And when that happened, the focus of the entire conversation narrowed sharply. It wasn't just Steve Harvey anymore. It became Marjorie Harvey. The moment her name moved from the background into the center of the narrative, everything changed. Because in celebrity culture, there are unspoken boundaries. There are invisible lines that people understand without needing to be told. And one of those lines is simple. You don't bring someone's spouse into the center of public controversy lightly. So when Katt allegedly crossed that line, it didn't just feel like commentary anymore. It felt like a direct hit. And that's when the situation stopped being entertainment drama and started feeling like something far more personal, something irreversible. But according to interpretations circulating online, Katt didn't bleed into it emotionally. People began claiming this wasn't random at all. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't heat of the moment frustration. It was calculated timing, a build-up, a long observation period where things were allegedly being noted, connected, and stored until the moment they could land with maximum impact. And when he finally spoke, it didn't sound like comedy. It didn't sound like performance. It sounded like accusation. Not loud, not explosive, just pointed. And that's what made it land even harder. Because the core suggestion people took from his comments wasn't complicated. It was this: that the public version of Steve Harvey, the confident, composed, always in control figure, might not actually be the one in control behind the scenes. And the implication that followed was even heavier: that someone else might be shaping decisions around him. At first, the internet reacted the way it always does to uncomfortable ideas. It laughed, it mocked, it dismissed, because disbelief is easier than uncertainty. But that didn't last long, because once people started replaying old clips, the tone began to change. Not because anything new was discovered, but because existing moments were being seen differently. Interviews where Steve seemed unusually defensive. Moments where his energy shifted mid-response. Small pauses that now felt longer in hindsight. Facial expressions that people previously ignored suddenly became evidence in online discussions. And once that reinterpretation started, it spread fast. But then something else entered the conversation. Something that pushed it further into chaos. Screenshots, alleged messages, unverified claims circulating online that supposedly came from someone connected to Steve Harvey's circle. Nobody could confirm their origin. Nobody could verify authenticity. But that didn't matter anymore. Because in viral environments, perception travels faster than proof. And those messages, allegedly suggested something explosive: that Steve didn't always make public decisions alone, that certain responses were discussed, planned, or aligned before they reached the public eye. And that idea, whether real or not, completely changed how people framed everything. Because now the conversation wasn't just about disagreement. It became about control, structure, influence, a system operating behind what the public sees. And once that idea enters a narrative like this, it doesn't leave easily. Katt reportedly leaned into that direction even more, not directly naming systems or structures, but reinforcing the idea that what people see publicly is not always the full decision-making process. And from there, the conversation spiraled even further. Because now people weren't just analyzing statements. They were analyzing behavior, tone, timing, silence. Everything became a signal. And the most unsettling part, the questions started turning inward toward perception itself. Is that smile real? Is that calm personality natural? Or is it something maintained intentionally for the public? At that point, the discussion stopped being about one person. It became about image construction in general. But then Katt allegedly went even deeper. He brought the conversation back into Steve Harvey's past, specifically his earlier marriage to Mary Shackelford. And that instantly shifted the emotional weight of the entire discussion again. Because that chapter of Steve's life already carried controversy. There were accusations, emotional fallout, and public disagreements that never fully disappeared from online memory. At the time, it was framed as a difficult divorce. Nothing unusual for celebrity life. But now, people started re-examining it through the lens of patterns. Not isolated events, not separate incidents, but connected behavior across time. And that's where things became uncomfortable. Because when people start linking past and present narratives, everything begins to look intentional, even when there's no proof it is. Old claims resurfaced. Old interviews were reanalyzed. Statements that were once dismissed suddenly felt like they needed a second look. And the phrase that started circulating across social platforms was simple. What if it wasn't just messy? What if it was controlled? That one question changed everything, because it introduced structure into chaos. And once people believe there's structure, they start looking for patterns everywhere. Social media exploded again. Threads formed breaking down timelines. Users started comparing past events to present reactions. Clips were stitched together to create narrative sequences. Some people insisted Katt Williams was finally saying what others were too afraid to say publicly. Others said it was reckless speculation that had gone too far. But the loudest group wasn't either side. It was the group asking questions. Why does this pattern keep appearing? Why do these narratives keep circling similar themes? And why does it always seem like certain figures remain untouched no matter how intense the surrounding controversy becomes? That question changed the tone of everything. Because once people start focusing on patterns instead of facts, interpretation takes over reality. And that's exactly where this situation entered dangerous territory. Because now it didn't feel like a simple feud anymore. It felt like something people were trying to decode. And once decoding begins, every detail becomes meaningful. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every reaction becomes intentional. And right at the peak of this tension, a new theory started spreading online. One that reframed the entire situation completely. What if Katt Williams isn't attacking Steve Harvey? What if he believes he's warning people? That idea alone shifted the emotional tone of the entire conversation. Because warnings imply urgency. They imply hidden information. They imply danger that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And once that interpretation entered the discussion, everything Katt said was reevaluated under a new light. Not as comedy, not as insult, but as signal. And just when it felt like the narrative couldn't stretch any further, another layer started surfacing. This time not directly about Steve Harvey, not directly about Katt Williams, but about Marjorie Harvey's past. And that's when things began to unravel again. Because as those older stories resurfaced online, the internet didn't slow down to verify anything. It accelerated. Old rumors were reposted. Archived discussions were revived. Fragments of unrelated claims were suddenly being grouped together, as if they were part of one continuous timeline. And that's when the situation reached its most unstable point yet. Because once enough disconnected pieces are placed side by side, people start seeing connections whether they exist or not. And in this case, that's exactly what started happening. The deeper the internet dug, the less stable the narrative became, and the more uncertain the truth felt. Because at this stage, the story was no longer just about what was said. It was about what people believed was being implied. And that is where things stop being simple and start becoming something else entirely. It wasn't about what people were being told anymore. It was about what they were finding on their own. And that's where the entire situation took a darker, more unstable turn. Because once the search shifted from public statements to private digging, a new name started appearing repeatedly across forums, threads, and resurfaced discussions. A name most people had never paid attention to before. Jim Townsend. At first glance, it looked irrelevant, just another forgotten figure connected to someone's past, the kind of detail that normally gets buried under time and distance. But the internet doesn't leave things buried for long. The more people searched, the more the tone of the conversation changed. According to scattered online claims and resurfaced discussions, none officially confirmed, but widely circulated, Jim Townsend was allegedly connected to serious criminal allegations in the past. The kind of situation that once attracts attention from law enforcement and leaves a long trail of unanswered questions. And that's where things started to get uncomfortable. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about celebrity relationships anymore. It wasn't about fame or industry politics or even Katt Williams' comments. It was about something else entirely. The idea of proximity. Who was around whom? And who walked away without visible damage? That's when Marjorie Harvey's name re-entered the conversation in a very different way. Not through interviews, not through direct claims, but through online connections being made by users trying to map timelines. Some discussions began suggesting, again, unverified and heavily debated, that she was present or at least adjacent to that earlier period of Jim Townsend's life. Others pushed back hard, calling it distortion and reckless speculation. But once a narrative like this starts circulating, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads, and the emotional tone of the entire discussion shifted again. Because now people weren't just talking about relationships or influence. They were talking about survival patterns, about outcomes, about who gets caught in chaos, and who doesn't seem to carry any visible fallout at all. That became the central obsession. Then the conversation widened further. Another name entered the discussion, Darnell Woods. And just like before, the pattern theory began to take shape again. Online timelines started linking sequences of relationships, transitions, and life events. The speed of certain changes became part of the speculation. The gaps between relationships, the overlaps, the timing. Nothing was officially proven, but the structure people were building in their minds started to feel consistent to them. And then came the part that really escalated everything. Darnell Woods also had a history that included legal trouble and criminal charges. That part was documented. That part wasn't disputed. But what fueled online discussion wasn't just his story. It was what people claimed they noticed afterward. Because once again, Marjorie Harvey remained untouched by any direct legal or public consequence in connection to those events. No charges, no formal allegations tied to her name, no legal fallout. And that contrast, whether coincidence or not, became the focus of endless online analysis. At that point, the internet stopped treating it like separate stories. It started treating it like one continuous pattern. And that's when things became viral in a way that couldn't be contained. Posts began circulating with bold claims like, "Everyone around her falls into chaos, but she walks away clean." Not as fact, but as interpretation, as theory, as emotional conclusion drawn from scattered pieces of information. And once that idea spread, everything started getting pulled into it. Even things that had nothing to do with it originally. That's when attention shifted again, this time toward Lori Harvey. At first, it didn't seem connected at all. Lori Harvey is known for her visibility, her fashion presence, and her high-profile relationships. In Hollywood terms, nothing about her dating history stood out as unusual on its own. But once she entered this already loaded narrative, people stopped seeing it in isolation. Her relationships began getting re-examined through the same pattern lens. High-profile partners, short timelines, sudden endings. And then one relationship became the centerpiece of discussion. Michael B. Jordan. Because unlike the others, that relationship didn't look casual or temporary at first. It looked serious, public, stable. Even long-term potential was being discussed by fans and media. So when it ended, the reaction wasn't just surprise, it was confusion. No detailed explanation, no dramatic public fallout, just a quiet ending that left room for interpretation. And that silence became the space where speculation grew. Online discussions started asking whether the breakup was entirely personal, or whether external influence played any role in the dynamics behind the scenes. Again, nothing confirmed, no verified evidence, just speculation layered on top of speculation. But at this stage, the internet wasn't separating those categories anymore. Everything was being treated as interconnected data points. Then came another claim circulating across social platforms, that during discussions about commitment in that relationship, a prenup became part of the conversation. Now in Hollywood, that detail alone means almost nothing unusual. Prenups are standard at high financial and celebrity levels. But online, it was interpreted differently. Not as a legal precaution, but as a turning point. Some discussions suggested that tensions arose around the idea, not just between the couple, but allegedly involving outside expectations or influence. There was no evidence provided, no official statements, no confirmation. But again, that didn't stop the narrative from expanding. Because by this point, people weren't asking, is this true? They were asking, does this fit the pattern? And once that question becomes the focus, everything starts getting filtered through it. Even unrelated interviews began resurfacing. Steve Harvey talking about relationships. Steve speaking about leadership, authority, and being the head of a household. Statements that once sounded motivational were now being re-examined under a completely different light. Every sentence was being dissected for hidden meaning. Every pause was being analyzed. Every reaction was being reinterpreted. And the result was a growing sense of uncertainty around something that had once seemed simple: public image. Because now people were asking whether the version of Steve Harvey the world sees is fully self-directed or shaped by something unseen behind the scenes. That idea alone was enough to keep the conversation alive. But it also pushed it into more dangerous territory. Because once narratives become this layered, they stop being about facts alone. They become about belief systems. And belief spreads faster than verification. At the same time, subtle reactions from within the entertainment space began to surface. Not direct responses, not confirmations or denials, but silence in places where people expected clarity. And that silence became its own kind of signal online. Because when people expect answers and don't get them, they don't stop asking questions. They escalate them. And that's exactly what happened here. The conversation reached a point where it was no longer about one claim, or one interview, or one relationship. It became about everything at once. Past relationships, public image, timing of events, patterns of outcomes, and perceived consistency across years. All of it collapsing into one central, uncomfortable idea. That may be the story people have believed for years isn't the full story. And just as that idea reached its peak, the internet reacted the way it always does when a narrative becomes emotionally charged and widely shared. It divided. Hard. One side fully aligned with Katt Williams' perspective, saying he's finally saying what others were afraid to say out loud. They pointed to old interviews, clipped statements, and moments of tension as evidence of something deeper. The other side rejected the entire framing, calling it speculation built on misinterpretation, warning that viral narratives often confuse coincidence with intention. And in between those two sides was a much larger group. Not convinced, not rejecting, just watching, asking questions, trying to separate signal from noise in a situation that was becoming harder to define with every passing hour. Because at this point, the story wasn't just spreading. It was evolving in real time, shaped as much by interpretation as by information. And that's what made it so volatile. Because when a narrative reaches that stage, it no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to the audience, and the audience decides where it goes next. It wasn't the claims that changed everything. It was what people started finding on their own. Because once the conversation moved from reaction to investigation, the entire situation took a darker, more unpredictable turn. And that's when a name began circulating repeatedly across online discussions, one that most people had never seriously paid attention to before. Jim Townsend. At first, it looked like background noise, just another forgotten connection from someone's past, something that normally gets buried under time and relevance. But the internet doesn't really let things stay buried. The more people searched, the more the tone of the discussion shifted. According to resurfaced posts, old discussions, and unverified online claims, Jim Townsend was allegedly connected to serious criminal activity in the past, claims involving investigations and legal scrutiny that, if true, placed him in a completely different category than what people initially assumed. Nothing about this was confirmed in a way that could be treated as fact, but that didn't slow anything down. Because what mattered wasn't just the claim. It was what people started building around it. And that's where the narrative changed again. Marjorie Harvey's name re-entered the conversation, but not in the way it had before. Now it was being attached to timelines, associations, old relationships being revisited through a completely different lens. Some online discussions began suggesting proximity to that period of Jim Townsend's life. Others pushed back immediately, calling it forced connections and irresponsible speculation. But by this point, the internet wasn't operating like a courtroom. It was operating like a pattern engine. And once that happens, context starts replacing evidence. The conversation stopped being about isolated people and started becoming about sequences. Who was around whom? Who moved through certain circles? And who appeared to emerge from chaotic situations without visible fallout? That question alone became the new obsession. Then another name entered the discussion: Darnell Woods. And suddenly, the pattern narrative intensified again. People began linking timelines, relationships, transitions, public appearances, and life changes, trying to map them into something consistent. Some of those claims were based on real public information. Others were interpretations layered on top of it. But online, both were being treated with the same weight. At the same time, the broader conversation began splitting into two very clear directions. One group fully aligned with Katt Williams' framing, saying he's finally voicing things that have been ignored or avoided for years. They pointed to resurfaced interviews, past comments, and perceived inconsistencies as validation for their interpretation. The other group rejected that entirely, calling it speculation layered on top of coincidence, warning that viral narratives often turn unrelated details into false patterns. But the most important group wasn't either of them. It was the silent majority. The people watching, not concluding. Because the situation had moved beyond simple agreement or disagreement. It had become something closer to uncertainty overload. Then something unexpected happened. Katt Williams went silent. No new interviews. No follow-up comments. No clarification. Just silence. And that silence changed everything again. Because without new statements to react to, the internet turned inward. It started replaying everything, reanalyzing everything, rebuilding the narrative from memory instead of updates. And that's where a new theory started forming. Not from Katt, not from Steve, but from the audience itself. What if none of this was random escalation? What if it followed a pattern? Katt speaks, react. Ian follows, clips surface. Conversations expand, old material resurfaces, new interpretations emerge. A chain reaction. And once people saw it that way, a new question appeared. Was that chain reaction accidental or intentional? Because if it was intentional, then the real story isn't just what was said. It's what was triggered afterward. That idea shifted attention back to Steve Harvey once again. Not for answers, but for response. Would he react? Would he stay silent? Would he address it directly or avoid it completely? Every possibility became part of the public analysis. And at the same time, Marjorie Harvey became an even larger focal point in the narrative, not because of new statements, but because of absence. No interviews, no public responses, no direct engagement with any of the circulating discussion. Just silence. And that silence created its own tension. Because in viral environments, silence is never interpreted as nothing. It's interpreted as meaning something is being withheld. And that's where the story reached its most unstable point. Because now the discussion wasn't just about events anymore. It was about absence. What hasn't been said. What hasn't been confirmed. What hasn't been explained. And in that space, imagination takes over reality. Some people believe it will all fade, just another viral cycle replaced by the next headline. Others think this is different. That something about this narrative still feels unfinished, like it hasn't reached its final shape yet. And then came the final question that started spreading across comment sections. If all of this is wrong, why does it feel so connected? Because if it's right, even partially, then the story isn't over. Not even close. It's still unfolding. And what comes next won't just add to it. It could completely reshape how people are seeing everything that came before. And that's the part nobody can predict. Not yet. Because right now, the internet isn't watching an ending. It's watching a build-up. And everyone is waiting to see what breaks first, the silence or the story itself.